Well, hello, everybody. Here we are on International Peace Day. And the question we're asking is, how can we apply the techniques of peacemaking to today's personal and global challenges? This is a practical discussion for you personally, but also for us as members of a community, as a member of nations, as a member of a world community. And I'm delighted to say my guest is Scilla Elworthy. And Scilla's spent her whole life exploring how to resolve conflicts peacefully. And we'll hear her conclusions on that. But it's really interesting to note that she got onto this journey as a teenager, amazingly, in 1956 when there were tanks rolled into Budapest. And she said, I've got to do something. And her mother said, okay, but you can't do anything now, you're a child. You can do something as an adult, and let's set you on that path. And that's the path she's been on since then. Completely. She's been highly acclaimed all over the world for her work, been involved with countries, with individuals, with communities, and those are the areas we want to talk about, but particularly in relation to the challenges we all face today and going forward. So that's what we're going to be discussing in the next 30 minutes or so. And Scilla, firstly, welcome and thank you very much for agreeing to speak to me today.
You're very welcome.
And by the way, for those watching, Scilla has actually appeared at Melting Pot in Ostrava as part of the Colours Festival. And there's a wonderful interview with her on the Colours of Ostrava YouTube channel, which I urge you to look at. It's only 4 or 5 minutes long, but it really is a very clear explanation of where she's coming from, which I would urge you to look at. But Scilla, let's start just with some definition, if you like. Can you just explain, please, what are your key approaches to peacemaking? What are the big takeaways people should have to the things that they understand, about the principles you would urge them to apply?
Thank you, Stuart. Having worked with, I now work with about 1,800 different peace groups all over the world. And what I've learned from all of them is that what I would call the inner work, self-knowledge, self-reflection, is essential to be successful in peace building. And I'll say why. It's because unless we've faced our own inner shadow, our fear, we cannot be present when a crisis erupts. So a regular practice, a daily practice of some kind of self-reflection, some kind of either meditation, it could be walking in nature, as long as it's regular and one really looks inside and says, what am I up to? Or has a good friend who will do this with you. And this is really important because time after time, when people are faced with violence or with even a very severe argument, what we do is go into our head and work out the mental reaction to that, when where we really need to be is in the heart and in the belly, because that's where our strength is and that's where our wisdom is for tight situations. And I can give you a couple of examples. In Sri Lanka, as you know, there have been terrible clashes between people of different belief systems. And our colleague there, Dishana Jayawira, what she does is to train her associates, and they go into those communities, the Tamil and the Buddhist communities, and bring them together in an open circle, describe to them what's going to happen, and then have them listen to each other, to really listen to the point of view of your opponents, the people you've been fighting, the people you can't bear the sight of, and actually listen to them to the extent that you could, and often are invited to do, to repeat back to them what they've said. And not only that, but what you heard of the feelings behind what they said, and then change over and the reverse happens. I've done this in boardrooms with executives when they're having a huge disagreement, and trained them. They all think they're good listeners, but actually most of them aren't, and trained them in being able to really absorb what the other person is saying. And that means we can shift from the brain that says, I'm right and you're wrong, to the heart that says, oh my goodness, is that how he feels? And then you've got a bridge over which the two of you can walk. And that applies whether it's in a family dissent or in a group or in a boardroom or on the battlefield even. So that's one example. A more extreme example is what Gululai Ismail has done in northwest Pakistan. She, when she was a teenager, she started getting young girls into school, and her colleague Malala Yousafzai was shot for doing just that. But Gululai, completely undeterred, went further because she's fearless. She has mastered her fear. And what she does now is to go into the madrasas, the religious schools, and identify, she trains young people to do this, to identify young people who are being trained for jihad and go with them to their parents and discuss why the Quran would not approve of suicide bombing. And they've dissuaded over 200 young people from carrying out such a mission. And imagine just the lives and the carnage that that has prevented. So that can only be done if you're trained or if you train yourself in observing your own fear and meeting your own fear, even in the middle of the night when your inner critic wakes you up with threatening you for what you haven't done. And you have to really wake up and address your own inner critic. So I could expand on that, but carry on.
Extraordinary. I mean, fun enough, the business I run called Mutual Value is trying to, we talk about changing the mindset that people often have in a transaction where we're urging them to think win-win. So we're building mutual value rather than just value for me as opposed to value for you. But actually, you're talking about changing the heart set, which is, you can see how that totally changes the behaviors. And can you just, I'd just like to get you to explain that. So how does that change the behaviors of people when they're able to do that? Because
well, if I listen, if you and I are having an argument and we're really angry with each other, and I say to you, would you be willing to spend half an hour with me? And for the first 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to talk about our conflict from your point of view, but not pointing finger, just talk about it in the first person. I will listen to you so carefully that when you've finished, I will repeat back to you what I feel you have said, not just your thoughts, but your feelings about this. And then we'll change over and I will talk about my part of it and you'll listen to me so carefully that you can repeat back to me what you think I feel, what you're sensing. And I can guarantee that if we can do that, we will move from here, I'm right and you're wrong, to the feelings. And once we have the feelings in connection, then we have what I would call a bridge over which we can meet and actually begin to have a much calmer, much more open discussion of what's really wrong between us.
Well, obviously, right now in the world, and for perhaps the foreseeable future, unfortunately, COVID is causing increased stress, increased difficulty for individuals, often in isolation or unable to work in many cases. In communities, we're seeing that all the time. And of course, amongst nations with name calling, blame, people essentially closing in on their own country rather than even within the EU, people very much looking at things from a national point of view rather than from a global or international point of view. So we're seeing this everywhere. Can I ask you what your analysis is of how that will play out, given your perspective on how people could sort things out? What will happen in your view?
Well, thank you. Far be it from me to be able to address such a huge issue. But what I would say is that fear is taking over and is driving the agenda. And when we're in fear, we make terrible mistakes. So in a way, COVID is being an opportunity, I would say, for us to actually do some huge personal inner development. And that's not just something nice to have, it's essential now. So we need to really examine, I would encourage everybody to do it. What is it I'm really afraid of? And if I can get to grips with what I'm really afraid of, that will help me to stop lashing out and looking for somebody else to blame. Because this is all our responsibility. It's the responsibility of when I walk out of my front door and whether I wear my mask or not, right down to how can I assist my government to stop making the mistakes it is making? How can I be constructive rather than simply cursing the news or writing abusive letters or whatever it happens to be? We have all got to take responsibility for this international wake-up call that I believe the pandemic is. I believe it's waking us all up to how we have to find ways, not just nicely to work together, but actively to work together on issues like climate change, which is urgent now for us to deal with. And unless we can stop retreating into the blame game and actually move out and say, how can I make a contribution here? How can I get over myself on this and look at what I can do that's constructive? I'm just take an example. It's a tiny example, but it matters. When our local school was closed down, some of us thought the kids will have nothing to do. So let's ask if they would like to grow beans, because one of them's called Jack, and ask him if he wants a beanstalk. And the kids went mad for this. We had 20 of them on Zoom calls with their parents in their homes. They each had to have a pot of compost and put a bean in it and watch it grow. And I told them, you must talk to the bean because that will help it to grow. A week later, they were demanding another session. The bean had grown that much and they all wanted to show it to us. Those children and their families all now have vegetable gardens, whether they've got an allotment or their own backyard. And that's going to be essential if there is real social breakdown. We're going to need to grow our own vegetables. Now, you may think that's a long shot, but what I'm talking about here is how do we use our imagination to mobilize our local group, village, street to build our own solidarity on these issues, starting from scratch.
Now, one question though that arises for me, both in the approach you mentioned earlier and in that particular situation, we may share our perceptions of each other, but actually, having done that, I conclude that actually you are to blame. I've heard what you have to say, and I see where you're coming from, China or America or whoever you happen to be, but actually you haven't shifted my view of what. So I still need you to admit you're wrong, because I see that as the truth, and that may be in an individual relationship or it may be, as I say, on a national level on a COVID. What happens then when you've done that? You've maybe talked back, explained the other person's point of view, but it's been unconvincing. I still hold my original view.
Mm-hmm. If I may say so, you're still in mental judgment. You're still trying to be right because the other person's wrong. And that's not going to get anywhere. It really is not. People make mistakes. People in government have terrifically difficult challenges to face, and they're making a lot of mistakes. That's human. I wouldn't know how to deal with the pandemic in my whole country. However well I might be advised or not. So we've got to start using our empathy for those who are in those positions. It's so easy just to project out our righteousness onto them and try and get people to admit, as you said, that they're wrong. Never mind that. Let's shift to making an actual contribution, to making a suggestion that will help in our constituency, in our area, in our village, or a contribution to how the Department of Health could handle things better. Whatever it is, where our expertise is, to lend our expertise to solving the problem rather than just trying to be right.
Yeah, but when you say this at a national level, or, when it comes to conflict situations, how does that go down? Do people do that, and does it make a difference, or do they pretend to do it, or do they say, well, how does it work? Talk through the dynamics of how that works when you're dealing at that level.
Well, let me take a couple of examples. It's clear from the surveys that have been done that the 8 countries that did best in the first 2 months of the pandemic were all led by women. And that includes New Zealand, Norway, Germany, and so forth. And they looked at what these female leaders had done. And for example, the Prime Minister of Norway had said, I'm going to have a TV program exclusively for children, because children are scared, their parents are scared, and we need to find out what children need. So she had a weekly program, TV program, only for children, and listened to what they needed. Now that made a huge difference in terms of the willingness of the whole population to get behind what her government was suggesting that they do. And a similar thing happened in New Zealand and with Angela Merkel in Germany. So the encouragement of our leaders to take the human path, the communications path that is not wildly producing the next cure-all that will save the whole situation, but actually saying, what do our people need in order to feel less fear and more safe?
Now, just on that's not necessarily it's not necessarily that it's a woman who does that, as I understand what you're saying, but it's really any leader being in touch with the feminine aspects of their leadership, of their personality, of what's important. Would that be fair or not? In other words, it's an emotional approach, not just a mental approach or a rational.
Got it. We call it yin intelligence as opposed to yin and yang, if you like.
Yeah, no,
it's available to men just as it is to women.
Yeah.
And many men access it, but it is working from qualities of compassion, interconnectedness, integrity, obviously, but that willingness to communicate from the heart as well as from the head. And obviously empathy is a key element in that. And there's no mistake that those countries that have used this, whether it be male leaders or female, have been the most successful.
I think that's important because so often this can be presented as it's a woman thing. And actually it's a human thing, but the strong feminine aspect of all human beings needs to be accentuated would be my take on that. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I would agree with that. And I believe that's the future for us, because yang intelligence, and we may come to this towards the end of the interview, but yang intelligence has led us into a lot of very linear thinking about the future. It's led us into relying a tremendous amount on technical solutions to the future problems. And what we need now is to rebalance the yang intelligence that a huge, I would say maybe 80% of our thinking about the future is influenced by linear thinking. And we have to change that to rebalancing the yin with it. This is not a question of women taking over. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about using a different part of our brains and our whole makeup, our whole constitution.
Really interesting. But we've got about 10 minutes left, but I just want to make the point from that I think this thinking goes way beyond simply the peacemaking, for example, because network thinking, making different connections, is at the center of so much thinking in business, in politics, in ecosystem development, particularly strong in Asia, as I'm sure you know. And I hadn't thought of it quite in those terms before. But of course, the feminine element of this is women historically have always been much better at networking and making these different connections, whereas men have, because they were hunter-gatherers originally, had to be very linear and narrow in their focus. And that's how the world has developed. And this feminization is a very powerful. But do you see that happening? The question is, it's great, we can agree it. Do we then look across and we see, for example, the leaders of China and the leaders of America as examples who I would say don't exhibit this thinking. So do you see hope that is actually, that there are changes in line with this or not?
Well, hope would be a big word for what we see in the world at the moment. However, if we take an issue which has affected our politics a lot in the last 10 years, which is the decisions made in the Security Council of the United Nations. The veto, as you know, belongs to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And through their total mismanagement and inability to agree, those 5 male leaderships, they allowed the chaos and brutality of Syria to flourish with disastrous consequences, not just for Syrians, not just for the Middle East, but those injuries of war last for 3 generations. And we're going to have to pick up the pieces of that all over the world in refugee terms and so on. So the first thing we need to do is reorganize the Security Council of the United Nations. And if that can't be done, then we have to reorganize a new international organization that makes balanced decisions. That's just one aspect of what has to happen. The other thing I would strongly recommend that's immediately available is a report that's just come out called Rethinking Humanity. And it's written by 2 brilliant guys, both graduates of Harvard and with huge business experience, called James Arbib and Tony Seba. And you can find it online very easily. And what they're projecting is both absolutely terrifying and really brings us to our senses of what is coming down the pike towards us in the next 10 years. It's what they're projecting and all their projections so far on electric vehicles and so forth have been correct. What they're projecting is a huge revolution, both in our energy supplies, in our ways of communicating, in even the dissolution of national boundaries in all sorts of ways. You must read it. But what they admit, I think, is that what has got us into this problem is linear thinking. It's technical thinking. And what I'm putting to them now is how to rebalance that, how to make it tangible, that we can rebalance that kind of thinking in all the top areas of decision making with what we're calling yin intelligence. This is thinking which is mushrooming now, but it needs as many millions of us to get behind it as possible.
You said there were 3. Was there a third?
Third what? Sorry.
Rethinking humanity.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, electing women to govern us will certainly help, or men who've understood yin intelligence, but also using this wherever we work and wherever we function. In other words, as I said at the beginning, questioning the brain function of criticism and replacing that with compassion. I mean, it's literally as simple as that. How do we be empathic instead of self-righteous in whatever decision we have to make?
I come back to the question, though. You have conversations with people who either are or are very connected to those that are leading major nations in the world in the current structure. Whether we want a different world or not is a different question. Do you actually see evidence at that level that people that this is gaining ground, that people understand this, that those with power believe this is a way forward, or do you not?
Oh, it's growing, no doubt. And interestingly, it's growing very fast in big corporations. They've found that the levels of stress in big corporations are putting people out of action. The absenteeism rates are shocking. And so they're bringing in people like us to work with their populations to develop these kind of skills and capacities, improving listening, communication, all those things. Well, I work with the biggest multinational on luxury goods in the world with their global leadership team to do this, and have done. So that's one area where it's changing faster, actually, than in governance. But what we've developed now, first of all, when I realized how vital this is, just after Christmas, I realized I had a premonition that something was coming at us as a human race that was going to throw us into confusion. So I gathered everything I know about what we're talking about today, Stuart, and put it all in a short, tiny booklet called The Mighty Heart, How to Transform Conflict. And it's gone sort of wildfire. And now it's going into a much, much bigger publication, twice as long, which will probably still be called The Mighty Heart, because it's how you grow your heart instead of growing your brain, and make our hearts capable of doing this kind of thing, which is perfectly trainable. And now we've developed a training course, which is called the Mighty Heart online course. You can find it on my website, which will put all the links in the text, but it's called The Business Plan for Peace. On that website, you can find it. And the Mighty Heart online training course, the first run of it goes out in October. And it's a 10-week course where you can learn all these skills one after the other. Right. And we expect that to be taken on by a lot of corporations, even governments, just to enable their people to access this kind of intelligence.
Well, empathy is, as you know, one of those big words that a lot of corporations are using. You're obviously responsible for a lot of that, so you very much know that. Fun enough, work we do helping people to build collaborative relationships in delivering commercial outcomes. It's interesting when you do get people to change the way they look at things. They like it more. People are happier. They want to do that. I mean, most of us, however hard bitten and alpha male or alpha female even we are, most people really want to be like this, don't they? Is that must be
absolutely they do. And little children do. I mean, little children do it all the time naturally, until they learn differently. But we do as human beings naturally like to connect with the heart. We do. Well, it makes us feel better.
On that wonderful, Scilla, we're meant to be entering the age of Aquarius, which of course is all about this stuff. It's a very feminine age we're meant to be entering, if we're going to be a little bit cosmic, which is meant to see the rise of exactly the things you're talking about. So let's all hope that that is true. What you're doing sounds not just fantastic, but clearly is gaining ground rapidly. And it's doing so, I'm sure, because it aligns with what's needed and the way most of us really would like to be, if only we could find the way. And you have got the techniques and the way for us to be that way. So thank you once again very much. I hope that in future we'll be meeting in Ostrava, in Melting Pot, with a big audience in front of us. But for the moment, online, Scilla Elworthy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart, for great questions. Very testing and very useful.